this was the first example that was, I can say that was more painful than the other things the Germans did. But every time the Germans speak about being nur ein kleiner Ja-Sager, that I was only a little yes-sayer, that they were fulfilling orders. The history of the war is so full of examples of individual improvised bestiality that was not part of the orders. I don't think, by now we know historically that the whole Holocaust was very well designed, written up, scientifically examined. For instance, they designed trucks that engineers have figured out where the weight has to be, how fast they can go. The trucks that were used to have gas inside, at what speed, how fast the people died, with the greatest efficiency. It was the first time in history when total annihilation of one people was fully designed, administered, and executed as legal. But I am sure nobody's written down the story about get the kids, shoot them, and leave them for 4 days on the marketplace, lying without permitting burial.
And what was the date of that approximately?
I have no idea.
Well,
it was early, very early.
You said 41?
41, yes. Very early after the Germans came in.
And around what month?
Summer, because they came in June. It would have to be no later than July. Oh, needless to say, the panic was dramatic. And people were being taken out, shot outside of the town under the slightest provocation. My sister and I were then sent off to a house of a peasant for money, and we spent about a month or two there in hiding. During the day we were hidden. During the night we would go out, go to the bathroom and such. I don't know exactly why we came back, how my parents make the decision. The Jews still weren't in ghetto.
Excuse me, your parents stayed behind?
My parents stayed in the pharmacy. There were no other pharmacies.
They felt safe?
Well, they had no choice. They were told to function because there was no pharmacy for the population.
But you and your sister were sent off?
Right. We came back, and then sometimes in fall, the Jews were all put into a ghetto, but my parents were not, again, because there was no other pharmacy. They didn't own it. I don't really know whether they were paid anything or whether they were just left to themselves, but they stayed in the pharmacy. My sister, myself, and my aunt at that time, my maternal sister who lived with us, were sent off to an estate of a Polish nobleman who was a physician and who was a friend of parents. We were supplied with, I don't want to say false documents, with real genuine documents taken out from the archives of the church, but they weren't ours. So that we had birth certificates for Polish people. The only time I ever came close to using it is when I was sent to collect sugar for the farm, because it was rationed. And sometimes they would ask who you are, and I would have to give my assumed name. And about 3 people online before me, the girl who was really me gives her name. When I heard that, I said, oh, I think I didn't tie the horse and the sled well enough, and I left. But I still feel that grip of fear. We were there working.
Excuse me, what was the false name you had?
Yadzia Novak.
Novak?
We were on that estate into the winter. The ghetto was organized. People were put into the ghetto, and one day my father was arrested. I don't know how Mama found out that he was taken to the ghetto in Vilna.
And who organized the ghetto?
The Germans. I don't know what happened in the ghetto because we were totally outside of the ghetto. Mother got herself at night, of course secretly, to the Vilna ghetto and somehow managed to buy father out. I probably mentioned before my parents' financial situation was rather good. So there was always money. The Polish Jews in those days kept a lot of valuables in gold krugerrands and Russian rubles, but in gold, and jewelry. It even had a name. Even after the war, people talked in terms of the hard and the soft. The soft meant American paper dollars. The hard was gold or diamonds. And Mama managed to get father bought out. A message was sent to us to get ourselves to the ghetto. Again, a peasant, a father of one of my school friends, took us at night on a sled to ghetto, to the house of the daughter of that physician in whose estate we stayed.
And excuse me, where was that nobleman's estate?
Nobleman's estate was about 3 miles away from Svir. It was called Oleszki. We, by the way, left a cigar box, a metal cigar box filled with gold coins, dug in there. And in the days after the war, there were days in America when I was hungry, when we would have sorely needed it. We were afraid to go there because it would be very, very obvious if one of our families showed up, why we showed up, and we would have been arrested. It's still there in the basement. And we got to Vilna. We got to the house of the daughter of that physician. She has studied what groups of Jews go from work and to work at what time. We stayed in her home until evening, and dusk fell early. This was in winter. And we just stepped off the curb and joined one of the groups and marched into the ghetto. She prepared us yellow stars, which we stuck on when we were already with the group. Situation in the Vilna ghetto at that time was, relatively speaking for us, very good. What does that mean? It meant my father worked in the pharmacy in the hospital. Rations were very skimpy, but my parents had enough to add. That doesn't mean that food was plentiful. That only means that we were less hungry than many other people. Sometimes when I am amazed how much time and effort Americans spend talking about restaurants and about food, I always remember that food was such a constant topic of conversation. And we would say, when we survive and we're free again, I'm going to have this and that and that and that, raspberries and ice cream. It was always very, very high on the list.
In the ghetto, surrounding the ghetto, was there any physical boundary?
Yes, there was a wall with barbed wire on top of the wall.
And how tall was it? Was it tall?
Very tall.
And was there a gate, an entry door?
Yes. That's the one gate with German guards, and they counted people going in and going out. But somehow on the way back it was sort of easier. The group would go, they would say, go, the group from Soldatenheim, the group from such and such a German place, just go.
And your living quarters, could you describe them?
Okay. I was getting there. Why were we so lucky? Because an average apartment would hold 5, 7, 8 families, one bathroom. We had a space which was made into a room, but we had a private room for ourselves. It was probably about 8 foot wide and a little longer. It held one double, it wasn't a bed, it was a piece of plywood on, how do you call those cross things that are like legs? You know, where working tables are put on. It has a word. But anyhow, it was a piece of plywood for Mama and Papa, and another piece of plywood where my aunt and I slept, or the baby slept with my parents. And we were sitting on our bed, and there was another piece of wood. The word escapes me. It's a horse, which was used as a table. The rations were very, very skimpy, but we ate it. Now, what did we eat? We had a lot of cabbage.
Boiled cabbage?
Chopped cabbage, boiled cabbage, baked cabbage, potatoes. We used to have a friend of mine from school whose father didn't survive. She was with mother. Somehow they were very, very dejected, and they had nothing outside the rations, and they sometimes didn't have the money to buy the rations. So she used to come.
And share a meal.
And share with us the evening. So in that way, we were very much better than many, many people. But hunger was pervasive all the time. It's one of the things that doesn't come through in many of the films about the war, although I didn't see many, except for Schindler's List. But even in Schindler's List, it seems that if you survived, you were alive. But otherwise, things seemed to be okay, but they weren't. Everybody was hungry all the time.
Were there fighting amongst the Jews, amongst the people in the ghetto for food? Was there stealing?
Probably.
Do you see any?
I don't remember any episode that I really saw. There was a youth organization, which I belonged to, of which somebody said one day to me, the usual when kids get together, there are snacks and things. No snacks. What we talked about mostly is Zionism and getting out to the partisans. And there was a psychological, almost brainwashing. We wouldn't be accepted for the partisans, but we were being psychologically prepared to be able to say that if the need arises and the organization calls, we will leave family and go. I have never come to the point where I could honestly say that I would leave my family and go. Kids were very, very honest with themselves in those days. And I was always worried that either the ghetto gets destroyed or the organization decides to take out the young people to the partisans. There was some connection with the Polish partisans in the woods around Vilna. The connection was loose and most of the time very disappointing. Promises were being made of help, the promises. I don't want to say never because I don't have a study of every single group, but in my case, and I'll tell you in a minute why, promises weren't kept. And of course, everybody lived with the hope of somehow getting out.
Excuse me, could you clarify again the date of your entrance in the Vilna ghetto?
It would have to be in the winter between 42 and 43.
And also, what were the sanitary conditions, if any, in the ghetto?
The sanitary conditions I can only remember in the apartment where we lived. There was a rotation about going to the bathroom, about using washing facilities. We had a little tiny stove built, like maybe 1.5 by 1 foot in the room where we would warm water and be able to wash privately, not in the rotation. In the general ghetto, the histories that I would hear were awful. Diseases started spreading. And we were a very unusual, intact family unit.
Because?
Where there were adults, knowledgeable adults, taking care of the kids, providing extra food. The question is, how did the extra food get to the ghetto? Through the sewers. There was a lot of traffic through the sewers. People were smuggling things in, people were smuggling people out. But the ghetto, from what I remember, started being smaller because various places of work, people would get up 5 in the morning and go out to work. being able to go to work was a very important thing. Firstly, in various places, you could have some contact with the non-Jews, whether in terms of working out an escape or even just smuggling in some food, but that was very important. Some working places, if you worked for some military establishment, gave you what is called a shine. A shine is like a pass. And for instance, at one point, I was married to a friend of ours who had a pass like this. Later on, that was, of course, a fictitious marriage, but I appeared on his pass. At some later point, I didn't need to be married to him anymore. He was married to my school friend. And after the war, he actually married her sister for real. Many people did that for money. He happened to be a friend and wasn't. So there's various working conditions that gave some protection, temporary. But in other places, when the work was, say, a segment of road was finished, they very likely would just, road finished, Jews no longer needed, shoot them.
So your parents were working in the pharmacy at that point?
Only father.
Only your father. So what was your mother doing?
Mama was home.
And
At one point, she was out in some working places where they were cleaning things, but this was temporary. This wasn't steady.
And what were you doing?
I was going to school. There was a Jewish school.
In the ghetto?
Yes. It was Yiddish taught.
And who taught it?
Teachers. Legitimate teachers.
So was there some sort of organization in the ghetto?
Oh, yes. There were concerts organized. There was a youth organization. There was a lot poetry and written. There was a ghetto newspaper printed. What was very interesting all the time, cultural and educational life was maintained to various degrees, but the effort to maintain it was dramatic. We all knew that people are writing memoirs, and I don't know how many of those were found, but the effort that people made to document, to maintain, to educate, and emotionally, that was very important. The ghetto was getting smaller, as I said, and you started seeing children in the ghetto, because the ghetto was more and more filled with children who had no parents.
Were people discussing where the parents went?
I don't know. The parents obviously were killed, but the kids were left. And in the beginning, neighbors, friends, relatives would take care of them, whatever. But what I remember seeing, that more and more children sat on the sidewalks, sometimes with clothes, sometimes wrapped in rags. I remember very vividly, and that probably made a very strong impression when I started seeing kids whose feet in winter were wrapped in paper. They probably sold their shoes for food. And the faces started looking like the keen pictures. Huge, dark eyes that just stared at you, and it seemed that wherever you went, those eyes stared at you. They would get weaker and weaker. In the beginning, they would beg, they would ask, they would say something. Then they were just sitting, looking at you, and you had the feeling that you wanted to escape that look. After the war, for some reason, when I realized that some of the kids that survived were kids who never saw flowers, who never saw a tree, because they were little, they were born just before the war. Those faces came back to me. I realized that the impressions that come to you visually and emotionally probably show in your face and your eyes. But I have seen kids malnourished, kids mistreated, kids who were really emaciated after the war. But they were not like the Jewish kids. No, in Bellevue.
You're referring to as being a physician?
Yes, yes. We had a lot of kids who were really abused, who were starved. We had several patients. they never had that gaunt look, that awful, empty look, like there's no hope at all. I can't describe it, but I can see it. And as people were being killed and were dying of starvation and diseases, medical help was very, very scanty. The ghetto was getting smaller. I remember once coming back from school, and we see columns of people with belongings, till the very last with dragged belongings, with belongings moving. They cut off 2 streets and diminished the ghetto, and everybody was being herded into the rest of the ghetto. And the young German soldiers, this is another example of were they only fulfilling orders, or were they improvising their own imagination? Young German soldiers, they all look like 19, blonde, blue-eyed, very handsome, like kids. Were running around looking about what the people had. And there was this young, blonde, childlike soldier with an armful of fur coats that he took off from women. And the woman was going with a carriage with an infant there. And I can, like slow motion sometimes, like in a dream, I cannot get rid of that memory. Maybe that's why I talk about it. He leaned into the carriage. He pulled out the infant by the feet. He walked over to the corner of a house, building. And I thought, oh, so that's what brain looks like. And I wanted to scream, give the baby to the mother, just take the carriage. Did he have to do that? That kid would probably die anyhow. But then he calmly took all the fur coats that he had, including that woman's fur coat, threw it in the carriage and went off with it.
Did anyone speak out?
Did anyone speak up? There would be absolute death immediately. He would take out a gun and shoot. And this was very common.
And you were only how old? 16?
That was 42, 43. I was 16. Somehow I have a memory of myself as younger, but I was already 16. So the ghetto got smaller. Hunger was worse. There are some things I didn't remember until Teddy was studying it for the presentation of the course I mentioned that we gave before. The Jews have blown up a military train, and somehow it leaked out that it was a Jewish work. And the leader of the underground movement,
which was?
Wittenberg.
His first name?
Wittenberg.
Wittenberg?
I don't remember his first name. Was in ghetto. The Germans demanded his surrender, or they will destroy the ghetto. And that's another feeling that I can almost physically feel. You didn't want him to die. He was a very charismatic young man. You wanted him safe, and at the same time you wanted the ghetto to survive. Because the pervading feeling was, we're not going to give up till the last minute. Another day, liberation will come. The Allies will come. So everybody wanted to just push to survive a little longer. Finally, he gave himself up, and he was shot.
Do you recall the month?
The month?
And the year?
But
the season?
But that's history. See, when Teddy started and he said Wittenberg, I said, who is that? And then suddenly it came like a deja vu. But that's available any place. That's a well-known fact. At one point, I had a little feeling of freedom because my parents smuggled me out to the partisans. And I was for several weeks in the forest working as a courier. I think I was more impressed by the fact that I was sitting with peasants drinking bootleg rather than the fact that I could be shot any minute. we didn't get enough support from the non-Jewish partisans, and we were starving, and we had no ammunition, we had to go back. But that was one of my soldiering experiences.
July 26, 1995, we're speaking with Dr. Paula Neyman. This is tape 3. Dr. Neyman, you were describing your experiences in the Vilna Ghetto. Could you please continue to tell us what happened towards the end of your stay in the Vilna Ghetto?
In fall, I think it was September 43, the Vilna Ghetto was liquidated. Basically, whoever was still in ghetto was herded out to a big area. It was a hill called Rosa, and everybody was seated there. We arrived there because it was quite a walk in the evening, and we sat there through the night.
Who herded you there, please?
The Germans, and lots of Ukrainians too. We were sitting on that slimy, wet, slippery, grassy hill, and we were sliding down slowly, so that in the morning we ended up quite lower and a lot more crowded than when we started. And when the sun started getting up, there was some movement, and somehow it became known that the Germans are segregating people, that they're segregating men and elderly females. But the young, healthy people are going in one direction to the right, the elderly to the left. My father was no longer with us because earlier that day, when somehow rumors were circulating that the ghetto is being destroyed and closed, we went to the hospital, hoping that maybe there will be safety in the hospital for the hospital personnel families, because we did have a shine, a protecting one. They didn't even let us into the building. We were standing on the right inside the yard, and all the professional personnel walked out in their white coats. They made them take off their coats and step over them as if symbolically they rid themselves of their professionalism, and they marched them off. We later found out they were taking to Estonia and later to the south of Germany. But we never saw them. We never had a chance to say goodbye. So we were then, my mother, her younger sister, my sister, this is 43, so she is 4 years old, and myself. And we realized what the rumors are. It became obvious that the baby is going to be vulnerable. And as I said before, everybody always dragged possessions. We had a big bag, like a huge laundry bag, made into a rucksack with stripes to carry on the bag. And we had clothes in there. We threw away the clothes, and we put the baby into that bag, and we tied the bag. It took the whole day, the segregation. They tried to push Mama to the left, although she was in her early 40s. But I thought of her then as old. But we pulled her, and I kept saying in German, she's a young woman. She can work hard. And somehow we all went to the right.
You were speaking on her behalf?
Yes, I kept yelling to the German, and I kept pulling her. Ja, eine junge Frau, sie kann arbeiten sehr schwer. We took a whole day, and at night we arrived at the railroad station where we were literally pushed into cattle wagons. But when you speak of cattle wagons, you speak about a spat for an animal body. This was pushed in without regard to how much space you need. So we were sort of suspended, standing. Some people could sit down on the floor. The wagons were closed, and the trip started. This was the hellish night.